When I was 13 years old, I tried to get into tabletop gaming, and I didn't have the slightest idea what I was doing. As a kid without any money nor any learned craftsmanship skills, I ruined a bunch of those absurdly overpriced figurines by gunking paint all over the painstaking textures, details, and ambition that those appropriately overpriced figures come with. It was horribly awkward. It was also a metaphor for Koei Tecmo handling the release of Fatal Frame 5. A lot of the original team were still on the project for this one. The talent is there, the ambition and ideas and texture and detail are all there, but a sloppy, rushed level of quality gives the impression that the polishing stages were handed off to amateurs. Fatal Frame 5 is not scary. It doesn't control well, it doesn't animate well, its characters are oblivious and robotic, and any kind of basic technical overview of this game would leave it at that. A review without subjectivity, without bias, a review without an opinion would rightly state that this game is sloppy, and they wouldn't be wrong, but that's not fair to the game nor to you, the audience. Here's a nutshell example of the issue. The game's honest dedication to building an experience rife with constant uneasiness employs a game mechanic just for grabbing items off the floor. Holding down a button to control your character's arms gives the world just a little extra layer of tactile feel to it, and it keeps the unpredictable horror atmosphere going when it would usually stop. Usually, getting a key or an item is a good thing in a horror game. It's something to look forward to. But not here. You can't relax even when picking up healing items, and that's great. Sometimes a ghost arm will come out and grab you while you try to grab stuff, but couldn't it look less like a Gorad shaded normal arm that just has baking flour all over it? Shouldn't there be some kind of loud stinger noise, or shouldn't it punish the player more than just a sliver of health? And if you succeed this little reflex check, then shouldn't everything not be clipping through everything else? Shouldn't the item in question not be floating above the ground? This is what we're dealing with. This isn't a deadly premonition situation where the technical issues give the game its charm. This is an honest-to-God, Japanese veteran quality survival horror effort that was hamstrung by its budget or its time frame or something. Because the previous games I played in this series did a much better job of hiding the digital duct tape holding them all together. This game didn't get a release with much fanfare. It just kind of dribbled out with spoopy memes, and after playing even the demo, you can kind of tell why Nintendo didn't want it dominating the few headlines they have going for them this holiday. Because as much as I do think I like this game, I can't imagine anyone saying that it doesn't control like dog shit. There's this awful latency to your camera movement. Your viewpoint steadily winds up to move once you tilt the right stick. Oceans close, new mountain ranges form, geologic time passes before you're finally pointed at what you want to look at, and then you release. And it steadily slows to a stop and probably misses what you wanted to point at in the first place. It's also weirdly panned much farther to the left than your usual third-person shoulder cam. There's always going to be more shoulder in your view than your actual focal point, and the camera's always going to be moving too slow. So before you start, go ahead and crank that sensitivity all the way up. And while you're at it, change the dialogue language to Japanese, because
I'm sure you'll do well.
So what they did with Fatal Frame this time is give it a slowly moving Neo Resident Evil camera that for some reason affects your character's L-stick movements, and a sprint button that has your character bolting off even if you aren't holding down a direction. That's also the same button they used for resetting your camera behind yourself, so if you want to turn around and run away from something, which you will since this is a horror game, you have to put in a 2-stick, 1-button input that requires careful precision for a 2-second hold. There's a lot of concentration required and mistakes you can make just by moving around. What's also weird is the equivalent to the Dead Space breadcrumbs button that always shows you where you need to go once you hit the button. And this button must have been implemented by some executives who weren't playing this game, because levels are mostly linear tunnels that leave a lot of clues constantly showing you where you need to go in the first place. Plus, if you try to move and press this button at the same time, your character goes bonkers. It's hard to get lost in this game even without that button, because it keeps giving you these text recaps about what just happened and where you need to go, and that's even how it starts the game, with narration provided by voiceless text narration, and that is so weird. But there's also so much to love that I still want to give this game a chance. There is a good game underneath this gunked-up exterior, and a lot of it has to do with how weird it is, and what a George-specific thrill all of this is. This is a middle-market Japanese horror import in 2015 with a bunch of Wii U gamepad gimmicks. This is something I've wanted to see happen at least twice, since the closest developers have come to innovating on conventions with this console's gimmicks ended with a launch title called Zombie U. You view and control the camera with the gamepad, and that's a gimmick so obvious that it's almost like this console was made for a Fatal Frame. That idea never being explored would have been a far sadder reality to live in than the final game actually making good on that idea, but just needing a few extra months of polish. I can take that hit, which means this is a situation where I'm wearing my biases on my sleeve. I am willing to make excuses to enjoy this game because I love this genre so much. And it does elevate that genre in a few interesting ways. For starters, controlling an in-game camera with the Wii U gamepad is always a fun little novelty. In this case, it turns survival horror combat into a panicked clusterfuck of shared experiences and movements with your character. A personal, real-life sensation of looking down a viewfinder while still glancing at the outside world with your peripheral vision is something that can only happen on a borderline AR device like the Wii U. Just getting to play a game like this is a rare opportunity, it's a treat. And the rules of Fatal Frame have been changed to accommodate that hardware. This time, it's neither time nor distance that fills your damage meter, though there are still counter frames during enemy attack animation, so it kinda still is time, but your bread and butter for dealing massive damage is now all about capturing multiple targets in one shot. Imagine that this spooky ghost is a sandwich, and you're at a picnic, and there are flies hovering around the sandwich. So you wave your arms and shoo the flies away from the sandwich and then take a big bite out of it while they're hovering around but not actually on it. And that's a metaphor for how combat works in this game. Light hits generate new targets that hover close to the big target. Photograph all the targets at once and a whole bunch of numbers splat all over the screen to tell you did good. While you're doing that, you're cycling from cheaper to more expensive ammo for the heavier hits, while also using different specials, consuming different meters, and also using 2 different inputs for camera controls as well as a lock-on button. And really, there's not a lot of rules to learn, but there is a lot going on, and that confuses up a lot of the encounters because most ghosts want to flank around you in full 360-degree circles, which is too wide to reasonably track your own arms holding the gamepad across, so you gotta use the stick instead and fall back on motion controls only for fine-tuning. It's easy to lose track of your targets in the mental confusion of juggling so many different controls at once. But I wonder how exactly they could have solved that problem. And the only solution I can honestly think of is just by making the ghost AIs move around less, which would bite a chunk out of the game's challenge and novelty in the first place. And the clumsiness of this combat is not really a game-breaking issue, it's more of another skill to learn as the game goes on. I eventually got used to it. I noticed I was playing the combat much cleaner and smoother as the game went on, and I eventually came to like it, because like the sluggish camera controls, it harkens back to a kind of good old classic survival horror game that AAAs have almost abandoned. Combat in a horror game typically has always been hard to control. No other genre interprets the fight-or-flight choice as literal as survival horror does, and this is an example of what felt awkward in the late 90s feeling awkward in the mid-2010s. It's awkward for a purpose. It's not elegant, but it keeps you on your toes. It keeps you unsure of what you're even looking at because you're a terrified person in a terrifying haunted house being attacked by terrifying ghosts. And that's why I think your enjoyment of this game is contingent on your enjoyment of its niche. If you like wacky Japanese things, if you like survival horror, if you like silly Wii U gimmicks, it may actually be a pretty great time. This is what modern, mainstream horror games might have looked like in an alternate universe, and it's also one of the few Fatal Frames where I actually cared about what was happening next. In a super weird comparison to Metal Gear Solid 5, Fatal Frame 5 has you picking missions from a list, then hearing a recap of what's going on, then following your character into a haunted hot zone, grabbing something or person you want to rescue, and then extracting them out to go back home to a mother base where, instead of trying to activate cutscenes that aren't there, you actually do watch lots of cutscenes that are there. And they're really, really good cutscenes too. Short but powerful cutscenes following a troupe of characters whose qualities are tested by the horrors they endure. Unlike the last games, the narrative isn't so exclusively focused on the backstory of the ghosts than it is about these characters whose lives have led them there. Once you're done with every mission, you actually follow these characters back home and see how it affects their personal lives. It's following the tried-and-true horror philosophy of making the story more about the human drama of our cast of characters rather than the monsters chasing after them. Which is why I said earlier that the game is not exactly scary per se. It's less about the player being terrified by the constant threat of jump scares than it is about the player being sucked away into a dirty storm drain dripping with atmosphere, character, and a nefarious ambience of trouble. The villains aren't terrifying in the least, not at all, but the places the game has you going through, and the way you go through them are. There's a brooding sense of uncertainty everywhere. There's plenty of tight corners and shadow play to the level design, as well as that trick I mentioned earlier about how grabbing healing items gives the player another reason to be nervous. The beats that set the rhythm of Fatal Frame's pacing aren't straight scares, instead they're slow, strong struggles that drain your resources. The level designers scattered about all sorts of items that look like they could spring a ghost trap any minute, and a lot of times they don't. And with that restraint comes a feeling of immersion. I would say that this is a brilliant 15-hour pack of levels, but as the game goes on, you'll notice that a good half of these missions have you just backtracking through old places with a new character and new monster placement. But regardless, my first time through each of these areas, I was at the edge of my seat every time. But then for the retreads, it felt like just going through the motions. This is a year where Undertale is $10 and Witcher 3 is $40, and when asking myself if Fatal Frame is worth $50, the answer was a very reluctant maybe. It's just maybe, because it's interesting, not because it's good. Know that you're not throwing your money towards a quality product here, but rather a quality effort. This is a game to enjoy for what it tries to do and almost does, but not what it actually accomplishes. Which makes it hard to recommend, but it was easy for me to enjoy. Maybe not for you, but I thought the detail and ambition hidden underneath its gunky exterior was just prevalent enough to shine through. I have had less fun with many more polished games. And that's why this game was the jankiest and buggiest and most unfinished game that I genuinely enjoyed all year.